A woman stands in a Walmart checkout line in Boston, March. The fluorescent lights overhead buzz at a frequency that only people who have spent too much time beneath them can hear. She is holding a yellow box of cereal. In front of her is counting coins. 3 Ziploc bags, already sorted, already counted once at a kitchen table somewhere after midnight. His hands are shaking slightly, not from cold. She looks at his cart. Everything in it is for children. But one thing for him, and somewhere in the back of her mind, a door she sealed 11 years ago begins to open because she has seen this before, this exact cart, these exact coins, this exact man. Except the man she is remembering wore a different face and worked 2 jobs and came home after midnight and whispered the same lie to a child who pretended to be asleep. She does not look away. She cannot look away. I guess she never could. The cart, that was what stopped her. Not the coins spreading across the counter in a metallic whisper. Not the line building behind her. 2 people now, then 3. Not the fluorescent lights overhead buzzing at the frequency that only people who had spent too much time beneath them could hear. The particular pitch of poverty's ceiling, like the hum of every waiting room and government office and checkout line where time moved differently than it did in other places. The cart. Sandra Warren looked at what was inside it, and something in her chest pulled tight. Like a thread she had forgotten was still attached to something. Cheerios. Yellow box. 8.9 ounce. The cheapest per ounce if you did the math, and he had done the math. She could see that in the way he'd placed it on the belt, deliberate and exact. Plain of whole milk. Store-brand peanut butter, the kind with the white label and plain font that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. A loaf of white bread. A bag of small apples. A 5-pound kind that sat in a wire bin near the floor because they were $3.99, and every cent below $4 mattered when you were counting this carefully. A 6-pack of fruit punch juice boxes with a cartoon parrot on the front. Cotton socks, size 8. A bottle of chewable vitamin C. 2 wide-ruled composition notebooks. A box of colored pencils. Children's cough syrup, grape flavor. That was everything. She scanned it again. Slower this time. No shampoo, no deodorant, no razor, no lotion for hands that were clearly cracking at the knuckles. She could see that from here, 3 people back, standing very still with a yellow box of cereal in her own grip. No coffee, no anything that existed because this man was a person who had needs of his own. Not one thing for him. Every single item in that cart was for his children. And Sandra Warren had negotiated freight contracts worth 9 figures and had not cried in a business meeting in 11 years of running a company. She built from a rusted truck and a credit score that made loan officers nervous. Went to Walmart checkout line on Blue Hill Avenue and felt something inside her chest fold. Not break, fold. Like paper that had held its shape for too long and finally couldn't anymore. The boy standing beside the man had his hand wrapped in the fabric of his father's jacket, right at the hip, and he wasn't fidgeting. He wasn't asking for candy from the rack beside the register. Wasn't doing any of the things that 8-year-olds do in checkout lines when they're bored and comfortable and safe. He was watching. Eyes steady and brown and older than they had any right to be. Eyes of a child who had learned early that the world required paying attention. The little girl in the fold-down cart seat was asleep. 4 years old, maybe. Head tilted sideways against the plastic. A pink coat slightly too big. Sleeves rolled up twice at the wrist so her hands could find the world. Sandra was holding a box of Cheerios yellow box, 8.9 ounce. Same brand, same shelf. Legged position on the same shelf in the same store where her father had stood 27 years ago doing the exact same math in his head, choosing the exact same box for the exact same reason. She hadn't moved in 40 seconds. A cashier, a woman in her 50s, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, name tag that said Donna, was scanning items one by one, and the total on the small screen was climbing. The man had started unloading his cart with careful, deliberate movements. His lips moved almost imperceptibly with each item placed on the belt. Not praying, calculating. Donna read the final total, $44.18. The man reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a Ziploc bag. Then a third, 3 small plastic bags. One full of quarters, one full of dimes. The third a mix of nickels and pennies that had been sorted and counted, and probably recounted at a kitchen table sometime after midnight, just days, because that was when you did that kind of thing. After the kids were asleep, when the apartment was quiet enough to hear yourself think, and all you could think about was whether the numbers would reach. Opened the first bag and poured the quarters onto the counter. They spread across the surface with a sound Sandra felt more than heard. A metallic whisper. The sound of something that cost more than money. Donna looked at the coins, exhaled through her nose. Barely softly, the breath of someone who had seen this before and had learned not to make it worse with her face. She began counting. The line shifted behind Sandra. A man in a Red Sox cap near the back muttered something under his breath. A woman 2 spots back looked down at her phone with the elaborate deliberateness of someone performing impatience for an audience. The boy, 8 years old, and still on his father's jacket, watched his father's hands. The father's hands were shaking, just slightly. A hint of tremor that came not from cold, but from holding yourself composed for so long that the muscles finally start to fail in small, uncontrollable ways. The boy saw the shaking. He looked down at his shoes. He understood. At 8 years old, like standing in a Walmart checkout line in March in Boston, he knew exactly what this moment cost his father. Not in dollars. In the quiet currency that poverty charges on every transaction, like that doesn't show up on the receipt but accumulates in the body like debt that never clears. Donna finished with the quarters. Started on the dimes, the total was $44.18. The coins on the counter, all 3 bags emptied, like quarter and dime and nickel and penny laid out, added up to $40.85, $3.33 short. The father stared at the screen. His jaw tightened, like muscles around his mouth pulled inward in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with years of practicing composure in front of his children. His eyes moved along the belt, scanning, calculating, like the thing he could put back. His hand reached for the box of colored pencils, 12 count, $2.47. His hand stopped in the air above it, just hovered. The way you hover over something that belongs to your child, like knowing that pulling it away is a wound you'll carry longer than they will. A voice broke the silence, small. A whisper, "I don't need those, Dad," 7 words. Looked up at his father with those serious brown eyes and didn't ask for reassurance and didn't try to make anyone feel better. He just said the true thing, the only thing. He had looked at his father's face and understood the math and decided that the math mattered more than the pencils. He was 8 years old. Sandra didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't run the decision through any of the filters, logic, consequence, self-protection, that governed every other choice in her $4.7 billion life. There was no deliberation. There was only the boy's voice and the man's shaking hands and the yellow box in her own grip, and she stepped forward, placed her Cheerios on the belt right beside his. She looked at Donna. "Ring it all together." "I've got it." The man turned around. Not quickly, not startled, slowly, the way someone turns when they've been surprised too many times by bad news and have learned to pace themselves for whatever is coming next. He looked at Sandra. Gray hoodie, pushed up sleeves, no visible watch, no jewelry, wallet on display. Just a woman with tired eyes and a yellow box of cereal. His expression wasn't grateful, it wasn't angry. It was guarded, layered, like the face of someone who had learned that kindness from strangers almost always arrived with a price attached. And the price was usually your pride. "You don't have to do that." His voice came out level. "Practiced." I'd said this before, possibly to caseworkers, possibly to neighbors, possibly to himself in the mirror every morning when he decided that today, like every other day, he would figure it out alone. Sandra looked at him. She didn't smile, didn't reassure. She said it quietly, just loud enough for him and Donna. "My father used to buy the same Cheerios from the same shelf in this same store. I figured the least I could do is finish what he started." The man blinked. Like the sentence didn't make complete sense to him. She could see that. But something in her voice did. Something beneath the words that wasn't pity and wasn't performance and wasn't the hollow generosity of someone trying to feel better about themselves. It was pain. Raw, lived-in, familiar pain. One person recognizes, in another the way veterans recognize each other across a crowded room without needing to say what year or what they saw. He didn't say anything else. Sandra pulled out a debit card. Plain navy blue, no platinum edge, raised numbers. Nothing that announced what was in the account behind it. She swiped, the screen flashed green. Approved 4765. Madonna bagged the groceries with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had been behind that register long enough to know that some moments didn't need narration. Her eyes moved once between Sandra and the man, and then stayed on the bags. Anne picked up the handles. The boy grabbed the bag with the cereal and the colored pencils and pressed it against his chest like something given and possibly taken back. "Thank you." The man's voice was small. Nature fractured at the edges like glass held together by surface tension. Sandra nodded. She didn't offer her name, didn't ask for his, didn't reach for a business card or a phone number or any gesture that would have turned this into a transaction, but stepped aside and let them go. She should have left after that. The ritual was complete. 11 years of this same March 19th, and it was done. Cemetery and chrysanthemums and the walk through the store and the box of Cheerios and the checkout line, and now the day was supposed to fold back into itself. And she was supposed to drive home in the Honda with the windows cracked and sit in the parking garage for a few minutes before going up to the penthouse, where the city spread out below her floor-to-ceiling windows like something she was still learning to belong to. That was how it went, except her feet didn't move, because she was watching the man walk toward the exit, the boy holding his left hand, little girl still sleeping in the cart on his right. And just before he pushed through the automatic doors, the man stopped. He crouched down beside the boy and leaned close to his ear and said something Sandra couldn't hear. It was too far away, but she followed them to the parking lot anyway. Not close, not obviously. 3 rows of cars between them, enough distance to be invisible. Enough if the wind cooperated to hear. Anne's car was a 2001 Honda Civic in faded silver. A dent in the passenger side door, the kind that comes from a parking lot and not enough money to care about parking lots. One tail light held in place with red electrical tape opened the rear door and lifted the little girl out of the cart with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times. The exact angle of the lean, the exact placement of the hand behind her head, exact speed that kept her asleep. He settled her into a car seat that had seen better years and clicked the buckle. She didn't wake up. The boy climbed in on his own and buckled himself, sat for a moment with the grocery bag on the seat beside him. Then he looked out the window at his father, who was folding the cart and pushing it to the nearby return. "Dad, I'm hungry." Simple. Not a complaint, a fact. Anne reached into the grocery bag through the open rear door and pulled out a sleeve of saltine crackers. He handed it through. The boy took it, tore the plastic, bit one. Crumbs fell on his jacket. He chewed for a moment, bucking out the windshield, and then he turned and held the sleeve back toward the open door. "You want some?" The man, standing in a Walmart parking lot on Blue Hill Avenue in a jacket too thin for March in Boston, looked at his son with a smile that had been passed down through generations of people who loved harder than they were loved back. But 5 words. "Papa already ate, son. You go ahead." Sandra was standing 3 parking spaces away, both hands on the hood of her own Honda, the metal cold under her palms. Late afternoon sun going amber behind the buildings on Blue Hill Avenue. The wind carried his voice across the asphalt directly into the center of her chest. "Papa already ate." The same words. The exact same words, the same cadence, eye wrapped in the same loveless word, with the same smile that didn't quite reach the eyes because the stomach behind it was empty, and had been empty since yesterday, and maybe the day before that, and it didn't matter because the boy was eating and the boy didn't need to know. 11 years. 11 years of holding it together. Marcus. Of building and acquiring and filling the penthouse with furniture that cost more than her childhood apartment, and telling herself that was the same as filling the other thing, the hollow thing, that lived in the place where her father used to be. 11 years of not crying, broke open in a Walmart parking lot at 4:23 in the afternoon. Not a sob, not a sound, just tears moving down her face and her hands shaking against the cold hood, and the box of Cheerios she'd set on the roof of the car, catching the last of the afternoon light like a yellow monument to everything she had lost and everything she was looking at right now. Crouched the silver Honda back out of the space, watched it turn left toward the exit, watched the brake lights blink red at the stop sign before the car pulled onto Blue Hill Avenue, and disappeared into traffic. Anne stood in the parking lot with her hands on the hood and her head down. The sun kept dropping. After a while, she straightened, wiped her face with the heel of her hand, reached into the pocket of her hoodie and dialed. Lorraine Mitchell picked up on the second ring. 9 years as Sandra's assistant. 9 years of managing a life that moved at the speed of a freight network across 37 states. I heard something in Sandra's voice immediately, not in what was said, but in the space between the syllables. I need you to do something for me. Sandra's voice was functional, steady enough to issue instructions. Barely. Background check. A criminal, situational, employment history, housing status, children, medical if accessible, education, everything. I need it by tomorrow morning. Whose? Sandra looked at the empty parking space where the silver Honda had been. Didn't know his name. She didn't know where he lived. She had a license plate number she'd read while standing 3 spaces away with tears on her face and a box of cereal on her car roof. She read the number to Lorraine, and Lorraine, "It stays between us, of course." She hung up. Stood in the parking lot a while longer, the sky going the color of old brass over the Walmart sign, of the same color it used to go through the kitchen window of the apartment on Humboldt Avenue, while her father stood at the stove, reheating leftovers from the diner down the block, a same diner he never ate at, because the portions cost money, and money had a destination that was never him. Harold Reed had been 56 years old. He had been 56 years old and working 2 jobs, and the second job was the night job, at the security desk in the financial district building, where men in tailored suits walked past him every evening at 6 o'clock, with coffee cups and laptop bags, and the particular obliviousness of people who had never once wondered whether the person holding the door was a person at all. He had been 56 years old, and his back hadn't straightened properly since the warehouse injury at 38. 2 years of litigation, lawyers who took their percentage out of the settlement first, and the number that remained was enough to cover 3 months of rent on the apartment on Humboldt Avenue and nothing else. They had been 56 years old, and Sandra had been 32 and 3 years away from her first million, and the math of that was the kind of math that didn't resolve, didn't compound. It just sat there in the permanent column of things that couldn't be restructured or negotiated or solved by any lever she had subsequently built. She thought about what he had said once, late at night, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of black coffee and the electric bill open in front of him, not knowing she was awake, not knowing she had padded to the doorway in her socks and was watching him through the gap. The hardest part about being poor isn't the hungry baby. It's pretending you're not hungry so your child doesn't worry. He hadn't known. She heard that. She had never told him she did. She drove home, not to the penthouse. Not yet. Over the long way, down Blue Hill Avenue and then Humboldt, past the building where the fire escape still hung at the same angles and the ground floor windows still had the same bars, hiked past the corner store where her father had sent her for milk on school mornings with exact change counted out the night before, past the bus stop where he had stood every weekday at 4:45 in the morning in shoes that split at the sole 3 winters in a row, because the money for shoes had been redirected to her school supplies and her winter coat and the fees for the after-school program that kept her off the streets while he worked the first job before the second job started. She didn't stop. She just drove past and let the neighborhood be the neighborhood. Not a symbol, not a lesson. Just a place where people lived and worked and got through the week however they could. Eventually, she got on the highway and the city fell away behind her, and she sat in the back of her own life for a while, suspended between what had happened and what she was going to do about it. Because she was going to do something. She knew that the way she knew most things. Not from deliberation, but from the settled certainty that arrived when a decision had already been made somewhere deeper than thought. The penthouse was quiet when she got home. Floor-to-ceiling windows had gone dark. The city spread out below like a circuit board. All those lit squares and moving lights, representing all those people getting through their evenings. At the glass for a moment, without turning on the lamps, the Cartier tank on her wrist read 6:48. She'd bought the watch on the day the company crossed $1 billion in revenue. Not because she cared about watches, because she had stood at a jeweler's case for 40 minutes before allowing herself to buy it, running the numbers in her head, calculating what else the money could do, what it would look like to spend that much on something purely, entirely, for herself. No utility, no return on investment. Just a beautiful object that would sit on her wrist and tell her she had arrived somewhere. She had arrived somewhere, but her father's name was not on the door of anywhere she had arrived. Reed had worked the warehouse in South Boston from before dawn until early afternoon, bending and lifting in a space with no climate control, where the summer turned the metal roof into a radiator, and the winter came through the loading dock doors like something alive. I had worked the security desk in the financial district building from 3 until 11. Sitting very straight behind a marble counter in a uniform that was pressed every Sunday evening, making sure his shoes were clean even when the soles were starting to separate. Baker's appearance was the one thing he could control, and he controlled it with the focused discipline of a man who understood that dignity wasn't something the world gave you. You assembled it yourself, from whatever you had. Every single day. They had understood that about him from the time she was old enough to notice the pressed uniform, the clean shoes, the way he held his posture in public regardless of how his back felt, the way he never complained about his back at all, actually. Not once, not in her presence, as if the injury and the litigation and the settlement were simply a thing that had happened to the body he lived in and not a story worth telling. I'd spent 32 years watching him perform it before he died. And she had spent 11 years since building things and acquiring things and accumulating a life that looked, from the outside, like everything that should have fixed what broke when he went. It hadn't fixed anything. It had furnished it. There was a difference. He had known that difference. She was still learning it. She poured a glass of water. Sat at the kitchen island. The apartment around her was very large and very quiet and very dark, and she did not turn on the lights because the dark felt honest in a way the rest of the evening had not. I had been 14 when she first understood what those 5 words actually meant. Thursday evening in November. Her father had come home from the second job at 11:15, and she had pretended to be asleep the way she always did, listening to the sounds of him moving through the apartment. The careful closing of the front door, the refrigerator opening and closing, the brief run of water in the kitchen sink. I had been waiting for the creak of his bedroom door that meant he was finally stopping for the night. Instead, she heard him sit down at the kitchen table. She heard the sound of the electric bill being unfolded. After a long silence, she heard him say it to no one, to himself, to the empty apartment. The hardest part about being poor isn't the hungry baby. It's pretending you're not hungry so your child doesn't worry. She was 14, lying in her bed with her eyes open in the dark, and she heard him say that, and she didn't move, and she didn't go to the doorway, and she didn't tell him she was awake. She was 14, and she didn't have language for the thing happening in her chest. And she was afraid that if she went to the doorway and he looked up and saw her face, he would know that she knew, and the knowing would cost him something she couldn't give back. So she stayed in her bed. And the next morning he made her breakfast and told her to eat while it was hot and said he'd already eaten at work, which was not true. And she ate. That was what he needed her to do. She was 43 years old now. She ran a company that moved freight across 37 states. The man who had made her breakfast every morning for 18 years was buried in Section E, Lot 23, Forest Hills, cemetery under a granite headstone with clean-cut grass around it, because she paid someone $100 a month to keep it that way. She had placed white chrysanthemums against the stone this morning. Blake had told him about the Nashville Distribution Center. About the sustainability initiative Lorraine kept pushing her to prioritize. Oaks, about the gala last month, where she had sat at a table with 6 people who had never worried about a utility bill and smiled for 3 hours and felt like someone had sent her to the wrong event with somebody else's invitation. I had sat on the cold ground beside his headstone and talked until her voice went thin, and then she had driven to the Walmart on Blue Hill Avenue. And then this. She looked down at her phone. The screen was dark. I thought about the man's hands on the counter, the way they shook. She thought about the cart. Everything in it for the children. Nothing for him. She thought about the boy saying, "I don't need those." Like Dad, with the flat certainty of a child who had already done his father's arithmetic and decided the answer before his father could reach it. She thought about 5 words in a parking lot. She didn't know his name. She didn't know where he lived. Paid a license plate number and a company with a 9-year employee who knew how to find things. She picked up her phone, set it face down on the counter, picked it up again. There was nothing more to do tonight. The file would come in the morning, and she would read it, and then she would know what she was working with. Until then, there was nothing to do but sit with it. She sat with it. Sometime after 10, she went to the window again. The city was fully dark now, the river a black ribbon reflecting back the lights of Cambridge. She had looked at this view hundreds of times, and most of those times it had felt like something she was supposed to feel proud of. Destination reached. A number achieved. Tonight it just looked like a lot of lit windows. Behind every one of them, someone was getting through the evening. Some of them were figuring out how to close a gap. Some of them were counting what was in the account and doing the math for the week and deciding which thing had to wait. Some of them were putting children to bed and standing in the kitchen afterward with the refrigerator door open, looking at what was inside and doing a different kind of math. The kind you do when you're the last person awake and the only person who knows what the morning is actually going to require. Like some of them were already asleep because sleep was the most efficient way to stop spending calories. She had been 23 when she borrowed $300 to $400 from the credit union in Roxbury to buy a used truck with 190 miles on it and a transmission the previous owner had described as mostly reliable. The woman at the credit union asked her 3 times if she was sure, not in a hostile way, in the way of someone who had seen this kind of application before and understood the failure rate and was giving Sandra every chance to reconsider. Sandra had been sure. She had driven that truck herself for the first 8 months, 7 days a week, sleeping 4 hours a night in the cab when the routes ran long. She had eaten from gas stations and the break rooms of warehouses. Had worn the same 3 pairs of work pants in rotation for 2 years because work pants were a fixed cost and everything else was variable. 1 truck became 2, 2 became 7, 7 became a fleet, the fleet became a company. But the company grew until it needed a name, and then a CFO, and then a legal department, and then a headquarters, and then a suite on the 34th floor with a view of the river. D. Woman who had slept in a truck cab became the woman in the grey hoodie standing at a window at 10 o'clock at night, looking out over a city she had spent 20 years building something inside of. All of it real, none of it enough, because the work hadn't been worth doing. But because the person she had done it for, the person she had been building toward, the person whose face she had been holding in her mind during the 40-hour stretches, when the only thing keeping her going was the image of a kitchen table and a specific man sitting at it. That person had not been available to receive it. Harold Reed had died in a 1-bedroom apartment, $52 in the bank. I was 3 years too late, and 11 years removed from the worst morning of her life. And she still wasn't entirely sure how to live inside that fact, without it becoming the whole story. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass of the window, the same way she pressed it against the granite this morning, the same way you press your hand against a door when you know someone is standing on the other side. I listened to her for a moment, then she went to bed. She didn't sleep well, but that wasn't new. Her phone lit up on the counter before she reached the bedroom. Lorraine, a follow-up text. Preliminary search underway. Honda Civic 2001, registered to a James Carter, Dorchester address. Will have full file by 7 a.m. James Carter. She looked at the name for a long moment. He didn't know her name. He knew she'd bought his groceries and said something about her father and a box of cereal, and that whatever she'd meant by it, she hadn't meant it as performance. She'd seen him register that. The slight shift behind his eyes, when he stopped looking for the angle and just heard the grief underneath. Tomorrow there would be a file. There was only the city below her windows and the sound of her own breathing in a very large, very quiet apartment, and the knowledge that something had cracked open today that she hadn't known was still closed. Morning, the city came back gray and cold the way March mornings do in Boston. The kind of gray that isn't weather so much as a mood the sky gets into and holds for weeks. Sandra was up at 5:30, which was when she was always up, as 20 years of freight logistics had recalibrated her internal clock to a schedule that didn't care about weekends or grief or the particular disorientation of having cried in a parking lot the day before. Coffee, the penthouse kitchen, the Charles River visible through the windows, flat and pewter-colored under the cloud cover. She was at the island with her laptop open when Lorraine's email arrived at 7:04 a.m. subject line, as requested. Attached, F running to 31 pages. Sandra opened it. James Carter, 31 years old, born at Boston Medical Center, raised in Dorchester. Mother Beverly had been a certified nursing assistant for 22 years at a long-term care facility in Mattapan, 12 minutes from the Walmart on Blue Hill Avenue. She had worked the early shift, and leaving the house at 5:30, which meant she had been the kind of woman who spent her mornings the same way her son now spent his evenings. Moving through a pre-dawn apartment while children slept, packing a bag, cycling travel time against the first obligation of the day. Beverly Carter had died 14 months ago, 54 years old. Complications from type 2 diabetes that had been poorly managed for the last 6 years. Because managing it properly required medication and regular monitoring that cost money, she redirected every time to something with a more immediate deadline. The copay was $14. Some months the $14 was a gallon of whole milk and a loaf of bread, and the bus fare that got her to work and back for 5 days. Some months she calculated it differently and paid the copay. Most months she did not. Sandra set the coffee cup down. Harold Reed had died at 56. Beverly Carter at 54. 11 years apart in calendar time, 2 years apart in age, 1 zip code apart in geography. People who had almost certainly stood in many of the same checkout lines and waited for many of the same buses and worked in many of the same buildings, dying the same way, for the same reason in the same city, not from disease. Aided stent, from the math, from the accumulated arithmetic of years spent, putting every calculation through the filter of what the children needed first and what could wait, and whether the thing that could wait was something you could afford to defer, or whether deferring it simply meant the cost appeared later in a different column, compounded, the way all deferred costs eventually do. Sandra had read files like this before. As an employer, as a foundation board member, as someone whose company's charitable arm published annual reports full of data about food insecurity and workforce barriers, and the gap between what assistance programs offered and what families actually needed to close a week. Had read those numbers and thought she understood them. She had understood them the way you understand a weather report before you go outside. Abstractly. From a position of cover, James Carter's father, a man named Robert, only briefly in the file, before disappearing from it entirely, had left when James was 4. No forwarding address in the records, no child support payments Lorraine had been able to find. Last known location, outside Massachusetts. Contact with son after departure, none. James had graduated from his Dorchester High School with a 3.5 GPA, admitted to the LPN program at Bunker Hill Community College on a partial academic scholarship covering 60% of his tuition. He had managed the remaining 40% for 2 semesters. Once a clinical supervisor's notes had surfaced through a public nursing board acknowledgement James had received and posted years ago on a community health forum. The kind of thing people leave behind online without thinking. Supervisor's language, exceptional instinct for patient communication, above average clinical retention, particular facility with elderly patients who resisted treatment. One margin note. This one gets it, knows how to listen, but withdrawn halfway through his 3rd semester. Not because his grades had fallen, not because he'd lost the scholarship. Because the woman who had been watching Eli 3 afternoons a week moved to Atlanta to be closer to her own daughter, and the next closest childcare option that accepted infants on a subsidy was a 12-minute drive from the restaurant where he worked, and a 40-minute drive from the Bunker Hill campus. Overlap in those schedules made both jobs and school functionally impossible at the same time. Sandra had run logistics for 20 years. She knew exactly what it meant when the routing didn't work. Variables multiplied past the point where any single arrangement could satisfy all of them simultaneously. Something got cut. The question was only which thing. He had cut school. He had kept both jobs. He had kept both kids. Current employment, the restaurant on Dudley Street. 5 days a week, 5 in the morning until 1 in the afternoon. The commercial cleaning company servicing 3 financial district buildings 4 evenings a week, there in the afternoon until 11 at night. Eli, 2nd grade, age 8, at the Kenny Elementary School on Glenway Street. The after-school program at Kenny ran until 5:30 and cost $115 per month. James Carter's name did not appear on the enrollment roster, meaning Eli went home at 3:30 every afternoon, meaning Eli was alone in a 380-square-foot studio for 2.5 hours every day, 5 days a week. $115 per month was $115 more than his father could find in the budget. Sandra closed the laptop. She sat at the island for a long time without moving. Outside the windows, the sky had lightened slightly, the gray going a degree warmer as the morning advanced, and the river had picked up a faint shine. She could see a crew team from one of the Cambridge schools out on the water, 8 people moving in the specific synchronized silence of early athletic practice, the oars catching and pulling in unison, the boat barely disturbing the surface. They thought about a woman named Beverly Carter, who had skipped insulin injections for 6 years because $14 was not an abstract number. It was a gallon of milk. It was a loaf of bread. It was the margin between a week that worked and a week that didn't. And she had made the calculation that the week needed to work, and she had made it for 6 years, and at 54 her body had presented the accumulated bill. Days before Sandra made her first million, her father had died. 14 months before Sandra stood in a checkout line, Beverly Carter had died. There was no version of this where Sandra could go back and insert herself into the earlier story. No intervention available for Beverly Carter anymore. No scholarship. No phone call from someone who knew how to work the system. James Carter was 31 years old, and Eli was 8, and Naomi was 4, and the sleeve of saltine crackers was not the last meal any of them would eat. The story wasn't finished. She opened her laptop again, navigated to the Bunker Hill Community College Scholarship Database, banked a system she knew well, because Warren Logistics Group had given the school $2 million 3 years ago, as part of a workforce development initiative she had personally championed. She had meant every word of the press release. 80 colleges were the only on-ramp that people who looked like her ever actually had access to. The database showed 11 active scholarship categories, the third one, the Second Chance Scholarship, established 4 years ago, designed for adult learners returning to academic programs after documented interruptions of 2 years or more. Eligible expenses, tuition, books, and clinical fees for health sciences programs. Eligibility criteria. Based enrollment at an accredited institution, GPA of 3.0 or above, demonstrated financial need. She could see her own company's name in the donor attribution, but never imagined the money would one day create a path for a specific person she met in a checkout line. James Carter had been eligible for this scholarship for 2 years. No one had told him it existed. That was the specific, infuriating, heartbreaking thing. The scholarship wasn't empty. It wasn't a theoretical program that sounded good in annual reports and never funded anyone. Had money in it, some of it Sandra's own company's money, sitting in an account earmarked for exactly this kind of situation. James Carter had spent 2 years working 2 jobs and sending his son home to an empty apartment every afternoon, because no one had connected the available resource to the person it was built for. Not a shortage of programs, a shortage of connectors. She picked up her phone and called Lorraine. I need you to pull something from the Bunker Hill database. Second Chance Scholarship, Health Sciences track. I need the current application window and the deadline. A pause. And I need to know about the Boys and Girls Club on Bowden Street in Dorchester. After school hours, age, eligibility, cost. Lorraine was quiet for exactly 1 beat, the beat of a person whose job was to anticipate and who had already anticipated. I'll have it in 20 minutes. Sandra walked to the window. The crew team had gone. The river was empty. Like she thought about what her father would have done with this. Harold Reed had been the kind of man who accepted nothing. Not because he was proud in the defensive, brittle way that poverty sometimes manufactured, but because he had a genuine and considered belief that taking from a system that was already straining was the wrong kind of math. "We figure it out ourselves," he'd said, more than once, pressing her school shirt with an iron whose cord had a fraying section he'd wrapped in electrical tape. "We don't put our hand out." He had meant it as dignity. She understood now that it was also a limitation, that the pride and the refusal had been two sides of the same thing, and the thing they'd protected him from was not just shame but also help. The help he had refused, the programs, the supplements, assistance he'd been too proud to seek and too busy to find even if he hadn't been proud. That help had been there. It had been there the whole time. Dad built a company on the premise that logistics was about getting the right thing to the right place at exactly the right time. She had spent 20 years optimizing supply chains, eliminating inefficiencies, building systems to ensure that what was available reached what needed it with as little waste and delay as possible. She had never applied that thinking to this. Lorraine called back in 18 minutes. Second chance application window open until the end of the month, 15 days. Boys and Girls Club on Bowden Street. Free after-school programming until 6:30, Monday through Friday. Children ages 6 through 14. Enrollment open, no cost. Separate from and unrelated to the Kenny Elementary program. Also, Lorraine, I pulled his housing situation. He's on Geneva Avenue. Month-to-month lease at $11.50 a month. That's approximately 68% of his take-home on current wages. He qualifies for a Section 8 housing voucher. Waitlist in Boston is running about 26 to 28 months right now. There's an expedited track for single parents enrolled in approved education or workforce training programs. How expedited? 6 to 9 months. Sandra wrote nothing down. She didn't need to. The chain was simple. Activated education. Education activated expedited housing. Housing freed up income. Income stabilized the family. Let the children grow up in an apartment where their father wasn't working 2 jobs and solving every week from scratch. Every link existed. Every link was funded and operational and available. The only thing missing was a connector. Lorraine, she paused. "I'm going to need to make contact. Not through institutional channels. This needs to feel like a conversation, not a case file. I can get a phone number through public utility records. It'll take a day. Do it. Own up." Stood at the below her. The city was fully awake now. Morning traffic moving in its familiar patterns. The T running, the bridges carrying their load. Somewhere in Dorchester, at a restaurant on Dudley Street, James Carter was already 4 hours into his first shift. Somewhere in a studio on Geneva Avenue. An 8-year-old named Eli was eating breakfast before school, and in 37 states, trucks Sandra Warren had spent 20 years routing and scheduling moved their freight across the country's highways. Medical equipment, produce, manufactured goods, all of it tracked in real time, every delay flagged, deviation from the optimal path identified and corrected. She was very good at getting the right thing to the right place at the right time. She was starting to understand, for the first time, what she had actually been practicing for. Lorraine sent the phone number on a Tuesday afternoon with a 3-word note, utility records. Confirmed active. Sandra looked at the number for 45 minutes before she called it, not because she was uncertain. They had been certain since the parking lot, but certainty and readiness were different things, and she wanted to be clear about what she was walking into. This was not a philanthropic initiative. It's not a foundation grant or a line item in an annual report. This was a specific man who had spent the last several years refusing to let the seams show, and the worst thing she could do was approach him like a project. I called at 6:15 in the evening. Both kids would be home. It was a bad time. She called anyway, because good times for this kind of call did not exist in a life structured the way his was. Waiting for one was just another way of not calling. James Carter picked up on the 3rd ring. Background noise, the particular ambient sound of a small apartment with children in it, a television at low volume, a small voice asking about something in another room. Sandra kept it simple. "This is the woman from the Walmart checkout last week." I hope this isn't a bad time to call. A pause. A day of pause where someone is deciding which version of themselves to be. How did you get this number? Fair. Direct. Not hostile but not warm. A question of a man who had learned that unexpected contact from strangers usually had an agenda attached. I had someone look into it. Your license plate, she didn't hedge it. I'm sorry for not asking first. I want to tell you why I did it. But I need you to know up front that I'm not calling to offer charity. I'm calling because I found something that belongs to you, and no one told you it was there. Another pause, longer. The television in the background changed volume slightly. What kind of something? Not a question. A threshold test, the voice of someone who had been through enough disappointments to require the shape of the thing before committing any further attention to it. A scholarship. At Bunker Hill, it's called the Second Chance Program, and it covers tuition, books, and clinical fees for people returning to health sciences programs after an interruption of 2 years or more. She let that land. You've been eligible for 2 years. Application window is open right now and closes in 15 days. Silence, not the calculating kind, the other kind. The kind that arrives when someone hears a thing they have been avoiding letting themselves want, and the wanting hits before the caution can catch up. I withdrew 3 years ago. His voice was careful, controlled, like a man holding something at arm's length to see it more clearly. They'd have to review my file. I don't know what's still, just clean. Your GPA was 3.5 and your clinical evaluations were strong. There's nothing in the record that disqualifies you. The scholarship doesn't require anything you don't already have. More silence. I'd hear the apartment, the small sounds of a space that held more life than its square footage was designed for. Then, why are you doing this? Not suspicious this time. Genuine. Dave, the voice of someone standing at the edge of something they had been looking at from the far side for a long time, because my father spent his whole life qualifying for things that no one told him about. And by the time I had the resources to find them for him, he was already gone. She didn't let the silence sit too long. There's also a Boys and Girls Club on Bowden Street that runs free after-school programming until 6:30. They can start Monday if you want. No cost, no application, just an enrollment form. She heard something change in his breathing. Not hope, not yet, something before hope. The careful, maturized attentions of someone who had learned that wanting things was the fastest route to loss. You looked into my son. I looked into your situation. I wanted to understand what I was calling about before I called. He stopped. Otis started again. That's a lot of looking into somebody you don't know, I know. She meant it. I'm asking you to trust that it came from the right place. A long pause. The television went quieter. She had the sense he'd moved to another room. Buckleship, what's the process for applying? There it was. Not agreement, not gratitude. The next practical question, asked in the voice of someone very tired and very busy, who had exactly enough space in his schedule to address one new variable, if and only if that variable was real. She walked him through it. Step by step, without rushing. They explain logistics to someone who needs the route before they can commit to the destination. Bunker Hill website, scholarship portal. Second Chance Program, Health Sciences track, supporting documents, prior transcripts, a brief personal statement under 500 words. Deadline the 23rd, he said he'd look into it. She could hear it in the way he said it. Not the polite deflection of someone ending a conversation, the actual statement of intent, from someone who had already started running the logistics in his head. She hung up feeling less certain than she'd expected. Not about the scholarship, about whether she had handled the call correctly. Thanks to the explanation she'd given for pulling his information, had landed the way she meant it, or the way it could be taken by someone who had spent a lot of years being on the receiving end of institutions that examined his life without asking permission. Texted Lorraine. WIC eligibility for children under 5 in Massachusetts. Process and office locations by tomorrow morning. Lorraine replied in 4 minutes, already pulled it. Sending now, 9 years. The woman was extraordinary. Late. The WIC packet arrived in Sandra's email at 9 p.m. She read it her kitchen, with the second cup of coffee going cold beside her laptop. The Women, Infants and Children program covered milk, cereal, eggs, fruits, vegetables, peanut butter, bikes for qualifying households with children under 5. Naomi was 4. James was receiving SNAP benefits for the children but not enrolled in WIC, almost certainly because the two programs operated through different offices and the SNAP office had not flagged his eligibility for the second one. That was the specific architecture of the problem. Not broken systems, not absent funding, but programs that existed in separate buildings managed by separate agencies with no mechanism for cross-referencing the person standing in front of them against the full inventory of what was available. A family in need was not a network packet being routed through an optimized system. A family in need was a person with 2 jobs and 2 kids and 18 hours of obligations every day, and the requirement that they navigate multiple government offices during business hours was, functionally, a requirement that they perform an administrative task that people with the most time could barely complete. They had built a company on the premise that waste came from inefficiency, that the gap between what was available and what was delivered was always, at its core, an information problem, looking at the largest information problem she had ever seen. And it was being paid for by the people who could least afford to absorb the cost. Went to bed at 11 and was up at 5:30 and drove the Honda Accord to the Walmart on Blue Hill Avenue the following Thursday morning at 9:15 because she had a theory. A man who organized his coins into 3 Ziploc bags and sorted them by denomination before his weekly shopping trip was a man who ran a very tight routine. Tight routines did not tolerate unpredictability. The way you maintained a tight routine was by doing the same things on the same days at the same times, so that the variables you couldn't control, the bus that ran late, the kid who woke up sick, the shift that ran over, didn't compound against a schedule that was already at its limit Thursday morning. Same store. She was right. She found him in the dairy aisle at 9:40, standing in front of the refrigerated cases with a gallon jug in one hand and a half-gallon in the other, running the math that had no good answer. The half-gallon cheaper by the unit, the gallon cheaper per ounce, a calculation depending on how much they'd actually used before the expiration date. Ely was beside him, hand on the edge of the cart. Naomi was awake this time, sitting in the fold-down seat with a small stuffed rabbit that had lost most of its color from washing, chewing on the rabbit's ear with the focused contentment of a 4-year-old who had found a task. Andra came down the far end of the aisle slowly, unremarkable pace, the body language of someone happening to be in the same store, not someone who had driven 20 minutes, because she had a theory about grocery schedules. They who saw her first, his face changed. Not a smile exactly, but the softening that happens when a child recognizes someone who was kind to a parent at a moment when the world wasn't. He tugged his sleeve. James looked up, registered her. His expression moved through recognition, then caution, then a complicated stillness. The face of a man recalibrating. "I think we've met before," Sandra said. Ellie looked up at her with those level brown eyes. The Cheerios lady. She had been called a lot of things in 43 years. That one landed differently. "That's me," she said. James put the gallon back. Half-gallon only. The math had resolved in the half-second of distraction. Noted it. Not the choice itself, but the reflex. The way the calculation never stopped running, even when something else was happening in the foreground. "You called me last week," he said. "I did? Did you look into the scholarship?" "I started the application." A pause. He hadn't meant to say that. She could see the slight surprise on his own face, as if the words had outrun his caution. "I haven't submitted it yet. I need to get the personal statement together. Statement can be brief, 500 words or less. Just tell them why you left and why you're coming back." He looked at her for a moment. "Then, that's a longer story than 500 words. Then tell them the part that matters most." He shifted in his expression, not warmth, not yet. But the wall lost a layer. Sandra crouched down to Eli's level. Not quickly, not performatively, just making herself smaller the way her father had always done when he talked to her at that age. "You're at Kenny School, right?" On Glenway, Ellie looked at her with the directness that seemed to be factory installed in him. "Yeah, 2nd grade. I grew up 3 blocks from there. Did you walk to school by yourself?" She looked at him. 8 years old, asking to stay. The question that wasn't really about walking to school. The question was about whether she knew what his mornings looked like. "Sometimes," she said. and left it at that because he was 8 years old and had asked a real question and deserved a real answer. She straightened and looked at James. "Can I buy you and the kids lunch? There's a diner a few blocks from here. Like my dad used to take me after shopping." The wall went back up immediately. She watched it happen, the jaw tightening, the shoulders pulling in slightly. A practiced readiness to refuse that had been encoded into him by years of learning that offers from strangers came with strings. I know you don't need it." She kept her voice easy. "No pressure in it. It's pancakes. Not an agenda." Ellie looked up at his father. Didn't ask, looked. With the particular hope of a child who had learned to make himself small enough that his wanting could fit inside whatever his father could carry. James exhaled through his nose, a long breath. The breath of someone choosing to suspend their own best instincts because a small person was looking at them with very careful eyes. "Just lunch," he said. "That's it." Ina was called GG's, different owner than the original, same name, same laminated menus with photographs of the plates. Same corner booth by the window where Harold Reed had sat with his daughter on Thursday evenings when the math had worked out that week, ordering her the short stack and pretending he'd already eaten. Sandra slid into the booth without looking at the corner too long. "Some things you just moved past." Illy opened the menu with the intensity of someone for whom restaurant menus were not yet routine. Played the photographs with the focus he usually reserved for things that mattered. Naomi pointed at a picture immediately. "That one, eggs, sunny side up." She didn't know the name, but just the color. The deep yellow of the yolk against the white, and she pointed at it with her whole hand. James ordered coffee. "Black." "Nothing else." Sandra looked at him across the table. "You're not eating." He wrapped both hands around the mug, looked down at it. "I'm fine, I already." He stopped, the sentence broke off in the middle. He hadn't been able to finish it. Not here, not in this particular booth, but in front of this particular person who had stood in a parking lot and heard those exact words come out of his mouth and clearly recognized the specific silence behind them. She flagged the server. "2 short stacks, please. Plain for the young gentleman and one for him." She nodded toward James. "Butter and syrup on both." James opened his mouth. "My father said it too," Sandra said before he could redirect. Not sharp about it, just honest, level. Face of someone pulling on a thread they had been carrying for a long time, every single day for 18 years. "I'm fine, baby. Papa already ate. Don't worry about me." She set her coffee cup down. About 25 years to understand he was lying every single time. James went still. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has had a specific private thing named out loud that they have never said to anyone. Not the concept of sacrifice. People talked about that. What she had named was the specific texture of the lie, the particular shape of the daily performance, maintenance of it over thousands of mornings and evenings and meals that weren't meals. He passed, his voice was quieter now. Not a question, he'd figured that out already 11 years ago. 56. My mother was 54. But they sat with that for a moment. Not with grief, exactly. They were both too far past the acute stage for that, too long practiced at carrying it. Ached. More like the recognition that happens when two people discover they have been navigating the same piece of landscape from different directions and have just realized they are standing in the same place. The pancakes arrived. They attacked his with the unself-conscious joy of a child who had temporarily set down whatever he was usually carrying. Naomi poked at her eggs with a fork, fascinated by the way the yolk spread, looked up at Sandra with a very serious expression. "It's broken. That's the best part," Sandra said. Naomi considered this, decided it was acceptable, ate the egg. James looked at the pancakes in front of him without picking up his fork. Waited, slowly, like a man remembering a motion he'd put on hold. He cut a piece, ate it. For a few seconds, just a few, the set of his shoulders changed, not relaxed exactly, different. A space changes when something that has been held at tension is allowed to ease by 1 degree. He told her about Bunker Hill, not as a story, as a list, calm, factual, delivery of someone who has described a problem so many times that it has shed its emotional surface and become simply a set of conditions. He told her about the withdrawal, about the childcare arithmetic that hadn't worked, about the 2 jobs that had replaced the single ambition. He told her about the clinical rotation he had been halfway through, The elderly patients he'd been assigned to, the man in room 14, who had refused to take his medication for 3 weeks, and then taken it from James after a 40-minute conversation that the nursing staff had described as inexplicable. He did not tell it as a loss. Like a detour he had been on long enough that he had stopped actively looking for the road back. Sandra listened without interrupting. She waited until he finished. Then, if you could go back to school, what would you do with it? Looked at her. The question had landed somewhere specific. She could see him processing it. The way someone processes a question that arrives in the place where the thing they've been not wanting to want lives. Finish the license. LPN first. ARN. No pause. No calculation. The answer came the way truth comes when it has been contained under pressure, and someone finally removes the seal. I want to work in community health clinics. The kind in neighborhoods like this one. Can't afford to get sick, but also can't afford the distance to the big hospitals. Downtown, Sandra looked at him. 31 years old. 2 kids, 2 jobs. A studio apartment costing him 2/3 of his income. Nursing supervisor's notation in a file that said this one gets it. Knows how to listen. All right, she said. Let me make a call. He looked up from his coffee. His expression was not hope, artist man's. It was the very careful look of someone standing at the edge of something they have trained themselves not to approach, because the fall from the edge was worse than never having reached it. She stepped outside and called Lorraine from the sidewalk, while James finished his pancakes, and Eli asked his father something about the laminated menu, and Naomi arranged the remaining pieces of her egg into a pattern that apparently meant something to her. Lorraine answered on the first ring. I need the second chance scholarship eligibility checklist for Bunker Hill. Full documentation requirements, and I need to know whether a 31-year-old single father with a 3 and 2 completed semesters would qualify. Lorraine was quiet for 1 second. You already know the answer. I need him to know it. When Sandra came back inside, James was watching Eli explain something to Naomi using a fork as a prop. However Naomi thought of the explanation was unclear, but she was listening with the focused attention that seemed to be a family trait. The rabbit tucked under one arm, head tilted. Sandra sat back down. The scholarship covers everything. Tuition, books, clinical fees. You've met every requirement since it opened 2 years ago. The application closes in 15 days. He was quiet. The Boys and Girls Club on Bowden Street, she continued. Free. Eli can start Monday. OWAC help and a meal and supervision until 6:30. It's a separate program from the one at Kenny. No cost, no waiting list. Just an enrollment form. You don't need to reorganize anything. It just opens a window in the afternoon. Watched him process that. 2.5 hours every day that his son currently spent alone. Gone. Not with money, not with charity, with information he had not had. The WIC program, she said, Naomi qualifies. It covers milk, cereal, eggs, juice, peanut butter. It runs through a different office than SNAP, which is why it didn't come up when you enrolled for benefits. But the eligibility is straightforward, and Lorraine can walk you through the paperwork. Who's Lorraine? A assistant. He looked at her. Your assistant. She's good at this kind of thing. A beat. 2 beats. He turned his coffee cup slowly on the tabletop, buying time while his hands were occupied. Like a lot of things happening at once, he said finally. It's not all at once. It's a chain. One thing enables the next thing. The scholarship is first, everything else follows from it, and the housing thing, it without inflection. He had processed the first call more thoroughly than she'd expected. Section 8 has an expedited track for single parents enrolled in education programs. 6 to 9 months instead of 2 years, he exhaled slowly, looked out the window. On the sidewalk outside, a woman was walking fast with a stroller and a bag over her shoulder, and the look of someone already running 2 minutes late for something that started 5 minutes ago. Reached her pass without commenting. Why? The word arrived differently this time. Not the defensive why of the first call. The genuine why of someone standing at a door they hadn't expected to find, waiting to understand what was behind it before they decided whether to open it. Sandra held the question for a moment before answering. Because my father spent his whole life inside the same math you're running. 2 jobs, an empty fridge on the weeks when the timing didn't work. A daughter who ate first and a man who called that a normal evening. She paused. He wanted to be a fourth-grade teacher. He made an application for a program at Roxbury Community College in a drawer in his bedroom for 6 years. He never filled it out because he was too busy making sure I had time to do things with my life. Then he died at 56, without ever having stood in front of a classroom. She let that sit. He was 3 years from the moment when I could have changed everything. 3 years. And I've been living inside that number for 11 years. Looked at him steadily. You're 31. Your kids are 8 and 4. Whatever needs to change, you still have time to change it. I couldn't give it back to my father. But I'm looking at someone who hasn't run out of time yet. But didn't respond immediately. He looked at the pancakes, at Eli, who had given up on the fork explanation and was now drawing something on a napkin, at Naomi, at fallen asleep and sigist into the corner of the booth with the rabbit under her cheek and the half-finished eggs in front of her. When he looked back at Sandra, his expression had changed. Not open. He was not a man who opened easily. Architecture of the wariness had shifted. Something foundational had moved. How do I apply for the scholarship? She explained it. Slowly, completely, particular care she gave to instructions that needed to be followable by someone with no margin for error. Bunker Hill website, scholarship portal. Second chance program, health sciences track. Upload prior transcripts. He could request them through the registrar's office with a 2-day turnaround. Personal statement, 500 words. His prior enrollment record would auto-populate from the system. Handed him a piece of paper with Lorraine's direct number on it. She can help with the WIC paperwork and the Section 8 application. You don't have to navigate those offices alone. He looked at the number, folded the paper once, tucked it in his jacket pocket. I don't want to owe anybody anything. Not defensive, not proud in the brittle way. Just a statement of something he had built his life around. You won't owe me anything, she meant it. It isn't my money and it's not my program. It's yours. It was yours for 2 years before tonight. I just found it. He was quiet for a while. The diner moved around them, other tables filling and emptying, the server making rounds, access from a speaker, near the counter playing something unobtrusive. I'll look at the application tonight, he said, which was not agreement and not gratitude. It's the actual statement of intent from a man who had already started running the logistics in his head. Sandra recognized it. She had said it herself 20 years ago to the loan officer who had asked if she was sure about the truck. Look at it tonight. What it meant was, I'm already sure. She left the diner 15 minutes later. James stayed to let Naomi finish sleeping in the booth corner. A had abandoned the napkin drawing and was reading the back of the laminated menu, moving his lips slightly over the words he didn't recognize. Sandra walked back to her car in the cold. A scholarship application window was open for 15 more days. The Boys and Girls Club enrollment form was 2 pages long. The WIC office was on Washington Street. Open Tuesday through Saturday. She called Lorraine from the car, going to apply. I need you to make sure someone at the Bunker Hill Scholarship office is ready to move his file quickly once it comes in. Don't make it obvious. Just make sure there's no administrative delay. Done. Anything else? Ike appointment. Can you get a Saturday slot at the Washington Street office? He can't do weekday daytime. I'll handle it. And the Section 8 paperwork. He'll need a case number before he can apply for the expedited track. Education enrollment confirmation from Bunker Hill should trigger it automatically, but sometimes it doesn't. Monitor it, Sandra. Lorraine's voice had a quality that happened rarely. A slight gentleness in it, by the voice of a woman who had grown up in Mattapan and knew exactly what she was looking at from the inside. I've got it. Sandra drove back toward the highway. She thought about what Lorraine had said during the first week of this. Programs don't talk to each other. SNAP through one office, WIC through another, Section 8 through a third, job training through a fourth, after-school programs through a fifth. Each one designed in isolation, administered in isolation, available in isolation, and the requirement that an individual navigate all 5 simultaneously was, in practice, a requirement that they perform at a bureaucratic level that bore no relationship to the actual conditions of their life. People who needed the most help were being asked to do the most administrative work. She had spent 20 years building a company on the principle that you didn't ask the cargo to route itself, The Cartier on her wrist read 6:58 p.m. Made a conference call at 8, and a board meeting in the morning, and a distribution contract to finalize before the end of the week. She had all of that. And she also had a phone number. She could dial every 2 weeks and hear a man report, level careful voice, that his son had started talking more. She got on the highway. It was enough for now. It was actually, genuinely, for the first time in 11 years, starting to be enough. The following 2 weeks, things moved, not dramatically. Not with the clean momentum of a plan executing perfectly. Things moved the way they actually move when real conditions are involved. Slowly, in some places, in fits and starts in others, faced one afternoon where everything seemed to stall, and Sandra had to resist the impulse to call and check. She didn't call and check. She had been very deliberate about this from the beginning. She was a connector. Not a case manager, not a guardian, not an institution. The moment she sat following up and adjusting and intervening beyond what was necessary, she became the floor he was standing on, instead of the person who showed him where the floor already was. That worst thing she could do, the thing that would hollow out everything she was trying to build here, was make him dependent on someone else's structural support. He had to build his own. She called once every 2 weeks. 10 minutes, at most. How are the kids? How's the program shaping up? Is there anything you need? The answer to the last question was always no, and she accepted it, because no was also information. No meant the structure was holding, like no meant he had found his footing and was moving under his own weight, which was the only kind of movement that was worth building on. James submitted the scholarship application on the 19th, 4 days before the deadline. Lorraine confirmed receipt and flagged the file to the appropriate committee contact. 3 days later, the award letter went out. Full tuition, books, and clinical fees for the returning LPN program, starting the first Tuesday in April. They called Sandra when he received it. She was in her office on the 34th floor, mid-morning, between 2 calls about a distribution contract. She stepped out of the office and took the call in the hallway, had not done for a personal call-in, as long as she could remember. His voice was different, not effusive, not overcome. He was not a man who had been waiting for a windfall to validate him. Leveled, but underneath the level tone, there was something that had changed slightly in the register. Like a string tuned up by a half step and now resonating differently when you pluck it. It came through, I know. You knew before I called. It would come through. I wanted you to be the one to tell me. A pause. That's an unusual way to do things, maybe. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the Boys and Girls Club, Eli started yesterday. Lay home and told me about a kid named Marcus who builds robots out of cardboard. He talked about it for 40 minutes. Sandra smiled. The Cartier on her wrist read 10:43 in the morning. Standing in a carpeted hallway outside a glass-walled office in a building she owned a piece of, and a man in Dorchester was telling her about cardboard robots. That's 40 minutes of talking, she said. That's good, a lot of talking for Eli. A beat. He doesn't usually talk that much. She understood what he was not saying. Like the 40 minutes of robot conversation was 40 minutes of a child unburdening himself of something he'd been holding alone in an apartment all afternoon for months. The volume of it was not just information about cardboard. It was the release of a pressure that had been building quietly in a small person who had never had anywhere to put it. Thank you, he said it once. Flat and real, ached, stripped of the ceremony that gratitude usually arrived in. Just the 2 words, which was the truest way to see them. She thought about her father and the kitchen table and the electric bill and the thing he had said when he thought she was asleep. "You're going to be good at this," she said. "The nursing, you're going to be really good at it." He didn't dismiss it or deflect it. He sat with it for a moment, which was its own kind of answer. Classes started on the first Tuesday of April. Sandra didn't go to the campus. She didn't make herself part of the daily rhythm of a life that wasn't hers to inhabit. They stayed in the background, the way she had stayed in the background since the diner. Present when there was something specific to offer, absent when there wasn't. But she heard things through Lorraine, heard that James had sat in the back row of the anatomy lecture for the first 2 weeks without raising his hand. She heard that he'd answered a question in week 4 that the rest of the class couldn't. connecting a concept from the lecture to something he'd observed directly when his mother's diabetes had progressed. She heard the professor, a woman named Dr. Angela Young, had paused the lecture and asked where he'd learned it. They'd said from my mother, and the room had gone quiet. She heard that in week 6 he brought food to the study group, made it himself the night before. Whatever he'd been able to put together, she heard that the group had a name now, Night Shift. 4 adults coming back to school after interruptions ranging from 3 to 8 years. Meeting in the study room after class 3 times a week, questioning notes and food and the particular solidarity of people who understood what it cost to be there. She did not hear this from James directly. He did not call between their scheduled check-ins to report his progress, not performing for her. He was just doing the work, which was exactly right. She was in her car on a Thursday evening, driving back from a site visit at the South Boston warehouse facility, when she passed the Walmart on Blue Hill Avenue. That sign, the parking lot, the automatic doors. She didn't stop, but she slowed down slightly as she passed, the way you slow down when a place catches your attention without announcing why. Looked at the entrance for a second, and thought about a March afternoon and a parking lot and 5 words that broke 11 years of sealed seams open in a single gust of wind. She thought about what her father would have made of all of this. Harold Reed, who had pressed his uniform every Sunday and kept his shoes clean even when the soles were splitting, who had believed in figuring it out yourself and not putting your hand out. He would have had opinions. He was a man with opinions. Found something to comment on. The method, the timeline, some specific logistical detail he would have handled differently. But underneath the opinions, he would have understood it. He was the most practical man she had ever known. I've seen the structure clearly. Scholarship to education to housing to stability to children who had a father who could stand up straight. He would have followed the logic, and somewhere inside the logic he would have found the thing that wasn't logic, the thing that didn't fit in a chain diagram or a spreadsheet, the thing that was just a person who looked at another person's struggle and recognized something in it. Drove past the Walmart and the parking lot, and back out onto Blue Hill Avenue, heading toward the highway. Lisa Coleman had not meant to become part of this. She had not been recruited. She had not been asked. She had not been presented with an opportunity and made a considered decision to participate, but simply looked at a situation and recognized it, the way a person who has spent 28 years teaching 2nd and 3rd grade learns to recognize certain things at a glance. The set of a child's shoulders, like the particular quality of a child's stillness, the difference between a kid who is calm and a kid who has learned to perform calm because performing calm is safer than the alternative. Recognized Eli Carter nearly 2 years before any of this. She had seen him in the hallway of the building on Geneva Avenue, coming home from school with his backpack properly adjusted and his shoes tied, and his face arranged in the composed, private expression of a child who had decided at some early age that his interior life was nobody else's business. Love recognized it because she had seen it hundreds of times in decades of classrooms. It was the face that children developed when they spent too much time alone with their own thoughts at an age when they shouldn't have to. But said nothing. It wasn't her business. Then she started hearing it, not anything specific. Just the sounds of the apartment below hers. The alarm going off at 4:30 in the morning, like the quiet movements of a man getting ready for a job that started before the sun. The absence of sound for the hours of the day when children should have been making the low-level ambient noise that children make. The particular silence of an apartment where an 8-year-old was sitting very still because he had learned that being very still was what the situation required. Teresa Coleman had raised 4 children in a 3-bedroom house in Roxbury, fed other people's children in a school cafeteria for 3 decades, had retired with arthritic knees and a pension that covered her expenses with about $40 to spare each month, and a television she kept running because the silence of the apartment bothered her in a way she hadn't expected retirement to produce. She was not looking for a purpose. Had a purpose. She was 71 years old, and her purpose was to get through the day with as little pain in her knees as possible, and watch her shows, and talk to her daughter in Atlanta on Sundays, and not become one of those elderly people who made everyone around them feel guilty for being younger. Then one Tuesday in late April, I had been standing in the doorway of the building getting some air. Her apartment faced north and didn't get the late-day sun. And she had watched James Carter come through the front door with Naomi on his hip and a school bag over his shoulder, and the specific posture of a man who was already thinking about the next thing before the current thing was finished. Watched him look at Naomi, at his phone, at the clock on the wall inside the lobby, running the time. She had done that math herself a long time ago. She knew what it produced. She stepped into the lobby. "Give me the baby." Ames had stopped, looked at her. "I know who you are," she said. "I live upstairs. Give me the baby. I'll watch her while you go to class. She'll be asleep in 20 minutes and I'll be watching my shows." He had opened his mouth, looked at him with the particular expression she had developed for 30 years in classrooms. The one that communicated that the discussion portion of this conversation had already concluded. "Mrs. Coleman. Miss I never married," held out her arms. Naomi looked at her, tilted her head slightly, assessing this new person with the frank curiosity that 4-year-olds bring to all assessments, then leaned toward Teresa's arms. That was that. Ames had stood there for a moment with the expression of someone unexpectedly handed a solution and still catching up to the reality of it. Then he nodded. Once, odd of a man who had learned to accept help when help was clearly offering itself without strings. "Thank you," he said. "Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday," Teresa said. "That's when your classes are." Explain how she knew his schedule. She had been in this building for 9 years. She knew everyone's schedule. Don't be late. He wasn't late. From that Tuesday onward, Asa Coleman was part of something she hadn't planned to be part of. She was just a woman who recognized something and had the available resource to respond to it, and that combination, which was rarer than it should have been, was how most of what actually worked in the world actually worked. Naomi took to her in the particular way that small children take to older people who are not performing kindness, who are simply being present without the anxious gentleness that adults often brought to children they were trying to impress. Asa held her, fed her whatever she was eating, let her fall asleep in the armchair, carried her downstairs when James came home. She kept it ordinary. That was important. It became a big thing. The moment Teresa started presenting herself as selfless or deserving of acknowledgement, it would change the weight of it. It would acquire an obligation. Oates would feel indebted in a way that was different from the ordinary debt of being helped. So she kept it ordinary. She took the baby. She watched her shows. She brought Naomi back downstairs. Ellie noticed. Children always noticed. Started appearing at her door on the evenings when Teresa wasn't scheduled to take Naomi. Not ringing the bell, just appearing, the way children appear when they have a purpose, but want to establish plausible deniability about having one. That evening he had the trash from their apartment. "Did you want me to take yours down, Miss Coleman?" She handed him the bag without ceremony. The following Tuesday he was there again. Same time, same question. Handed him the bag and he disappeared down the stairs and came back 2 minutes later with his hands empty and his chin level. He never asked for acknowledgement. He never waited to see if she noticed. Just appeared and performed the task and left Tuesday and Thursday clockwork for reasons he had apparently decided were self-explanatory and required no discussion. Asa had watched him enough in the hallway to know that Eli Carter carried a very adult version of loyalty. He had decided, somewhere in the private reasoning of his 8-year-old self, Asa Coleman had done something for his family, and that he would respond in kind with the currency available to him, which was his time and his labor, and the clean execution of a task that needed doing. Made this more moving than she expected to. She just accepted the task and let him go, because that was what the gesture required. In the second week of July, James came home from the late shift on a Thursday night. Teresa heard the elevator, heard his door, heard the brief low voice as he checked on the kids, and the following morning he knocked on her door. He had a small container of food he'd made, something he'd put together the evening before. Held it out to her without explanation. She looked at it. "You didn't have to do that, I know." His voice was level. I wanted to, which was the correct answer. The only answer that wasn't a transaction. About the container. He went to work. This was the second function of what Sandra had started. Not the institutional structure of scholarships and housing applications and benefit programs, but the other one. The one made of small acts and unannounced gestures and the willingness of people in proximity to each other to notice what was needed and move toward it without waiting to be asked. Sandra Warren had not built this part. They'd opened the door that let the first part move. But this part, Teresa and Eli and the trash bags and the container of food, this had assembled itself from the materials that were already there, like the way things assemble when the conditions for them are finally right. There was a woman on the second floor who had moved in 6 weeks ago, a woman named Kimberly, who was working the overnight shift at a distribution center in Everett and had 2 kids of school age who took the bus alone in the mornings. There was an older man sent on the 4th floor, a retired postal worker named Raymond who had been growing tomatoes on his fire escape for 15 years and had more of them than he could eat. He'd started leaving bags outside his door twice a week with a note that said, "Take what you need." Like the building had been full of people for years. It had been full of proximity and separate and largely anonymous to each other, in the way that apartment buildings in American cities tended toward anonymity. On managing their own conditions in parallel, the walls between them thin enough to hear but not thin enough to see through. What changed was small. A woman who took a baby on Tuesday evenings. A boy who carried trash bags downstairs. A container of food handed from one floor to another. The slight adjustments that happen when people stop treating proximity as coincidence and start treating it as a resource. They didn't know about most of this directly. She heard fragments of it in the bi-weekly calls. James mentioned that Teresa was watching Naomi, once, in passing, the way he mentioned most things about his life as a logistical fact rather than an emotional one. He mentioned that Eli had started talking more, which was the phrase he kept using, as if the Boys and Girls Club had returned to his son something that had been on hold. She did not ask for details. She was not the center of this. That was the whole point. She was a connector. She had connected some things. Things were now connecting on their own, the way they did when the initial friction was removed, and her job was to stay on the perimeter and be available and resist the very strong pull toward inserting herself further. It was, she found, one of the harder things she had done, harder than the truck, harder than the second year of the company. When the contracts weren't coming in fast enough, and the cash flow had gone tight, and she'd had 3 nights in a row where she lay awake running scenarios. Those things had required everything she had. They had also given her a specific thing to do with everything she had. Action, movement, problem to be solved by direct application of effort. This required something different. This required standing back. Was not practiced at standing back. She had built a company on the premise that being in the supply chain meant being active in the supply chain, monitoring every variable, flagging every delay, keeping the whole thing moving. The instinct to intervene, to adjust, to improve, was not just professional. It was the deepest expression of how she understood herself to function in the world. And here she was, like Fort, calling every 2 weeks for 10 minutes, and then hanging up and trusting a structure to hold that she couldn't see all the way to the end of. I thought about the difference between holding back because you were afraid and holding back because you understood that something had to build from the inside. She thought she was starting to understand the difference. But understanding it and living inside it were not the same thing, and living inside it was going to require continued practice. So she practiced. Summer moved into fall. James submitted his midterm results the week after they came back. Plus in anatomy and physiology, a minus in clinical fundamentals. His clinical supervisor at the rotation site, a community health clinic in Jamaica Plain, 7 minutes from Dorchester, had left a note in his file. Lakes referenced it on one of their calls. Patient-centered, intuitive, unhurried. Sandra read that last word in her mind, unhurried. She thought about a man who lived at the exact intersection of 2 full-time jobs and 2 children and a degree program, and who had somehow found the capacity to be unhurried with patience. You didn't learn to listen like that in a classroom. Learned it at kitchen tables in the dark. You learned it from being the person in the room who had the most to lose and the least margin for error, and had developed, out of sheer necessity, the ability to read a situation more carefully than other people because you could not afford to misread it. His mother had learned it the same way. Sandra hoped, for a moment that felt both professional and entirely personal, that wherever Beverly Carter was, she could see her son in that clinic room in Jamaica Plain, sitting with a patient who had every reason to distrust the system that was trying to help them, being unhurried, sat at her desk for a moment before the next meeting started. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Charles River was going dark with the early fall evening, the light going flat and metallic on the water. 6 months. At the Walmart checkout line to hear, 6 months, and the structure was holding. A call came at 2:17 in the morning. Not a call, actually. Sandra's phone didn't ring. She was already awake, sitting at her kitchen island with a freight analysis report open on her laptop and a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, pressed up with a text from a number she recognized. It said, "I can't do this," 4 words, no punctuation, sent at 2:17 a.m. by a man who had been awake longer than she had and had reached the particular wall that arrives when exhaustion and pressure and the weight of everything compound past the point where the individual components can be identified separately. It all becomes one heavy, undifferentiated thing pressing down. She called him immediately. He picked up on the second ring. The apartment behind him was quiet in the way that small spaces get quiet very late at night. Not peaceful, but held, like a container keeping its contents from spilling. She could hear the faint sound of the radiator. She could hear him breathing. "Talk to me," Sandra said. And he did, not in the controlled, level voice he usually brought to their conversations. A flat voice. The voice that comes when a person has used up every drop of the resource they use to perform composure, and there is nothing left to perform with. Just the fact of it, raw and still and very tired. A had been sick since Monday. Double ear infection, both sides, the pediatric urgent care clinic, 3 bus stops away, the antibiotic prescription that cost $14 with the discount card, 3 days home from the subsidized daycare. A's meant James could not work the morning restaurant shift without leaving an 8-year-old in charge of a 4-year-old with a fever, which was not a thing he was going to do. Which meant 3 shifts lost, $168 that would not be in Friday's paycheck, and the anatomy and physiology midterm was Thursday. He had been studying at the kitchen table since 11. It was now 2:17. His eyes were burning and the pages were blurring, and he had known the names of 142 bones from memory as of last week. But right now he could not have reliably named 20, because the part of his brain that stored that kind of retrieval ran on sleep, and he had not slept more than 4 hours in 3 days. I had not said "I can't do this" to anyone in 3 years. He said it tonight because there was no one else to say it to, because the wall had come up and the words were already out of his mouth before the practiced caution could catch them, and because somewhere in the last 7 months of bi-weekly phone calls he had apparently decided, without formally deciding it, that Sandra Warren was someone he could say the true thing to at 2:17 a.m., when the true thing was not good. Sandra sat with it for a moment. "Let it land. My father wanted to be a 4th-grade teacher," she said finally. Her voice was quiet. The penthouse was dark around her, the city glowing through the windows behind her, her coffee going colder. The application for a community college program in the nightstand drawer for 6 years. Every year he meant to fill it out. Every year the shifts ran too long, and the kids needed too many things, and the application stayed blank. Died at 56 without ever having stood in front of a classroom full of 9-year-olds and taught them how a sentence worked. James was quiet. He ran out of time, Sandra said, not because he didn't want it. They so busy making sure I had time that he forgot he was also a person with a finite amount of it. She paused. "You still have time. Don't use his up." The line held the silence between them. Not his time, she had said. His. Her father's. The accumulated hours of every person who had worked 2 jobs and missed meals, and told their children they'd already eaten so their children could have the thing that came next. All of that time spent in advance by people who would never get to spend it for themselves. It was not an abstraction. It was a specific inheritance, and the way you honored it was not by grieving it, but by refusing to let it compound. I heard something shift in his breathing. Not a decision, exactly. More like a recognition. The kind that doesn't resolve anything immediately but changes the shape of the problem enough that the person holding it can pick it up again. How many bones do you need for Thursday? His voice was different. Still tired, but different, all of them, Sandra said. But you've already got 142. That's a start. He put the phone down on the table. They'd hear him shifting, the sound of a chair and a book and a lamp. She didn't hang up. She just stayed on the line while he worked, the phone between them like an open channel, the city quiet on both ends. Asleep at her kitchen island sometime after 4 with the phone still warm on the counter. When she woke at 5:30, the call had ended. There was a text from 40 minutes earlier, 2 words, B+, and then, after a pause of about 30 seconds, a second text. Thank you. She looked at those 2 messages for a long time before she got up. She called him that evening, a little earlier than their usual schedule. Father would have been proud of that, she said. A pause, not his usual calibrated pause. Longer, with a quality in it she hadn't heard before, the faint pressure of something that had been held in a space too small for it. She would have, I said. His voice was low. Careful with the pronoun, the small correction that acknowledged she'd said father when he meant mother. She really would have. She understood that he was talking about Beverly Carter, understood that he had been carrying Beverly Carter in the particular way that children carry parents they've lost. Not with active grief, but with the ongoing weight of someone's absence from all the moments they should have been present for. The B+ was one of those moments. The clinical rotation note about being unhurried with patients was another. The night shift study group was another. Sandra thought about her father and the electric bill at the kitchen table. She thought about the things she had accomplished that Harold Reed never got to see. They sat with it for a moment without saying anything. 2 people on opposite ends of a phone line in the dark, each one holding a version of the same absence. March came back around, the way it always did, quiet and heavy. The kind of month that sat differently on her than other months, the air still carrying winter's last edge, the light thin and grey in the mornings and gone too early in the evenings. They got up at 5:30 on the 19th, dressed in the grey hoodie and the jeans she kept for this. Took the Honda Accord from the private garage 2 blocks from the penthouse. The car had 162,000 miles on it now. She had thought, briefly, about retiring it and had decided not to. The car was part of the ritual. The car was one of the things that still remembered. She drove down Blue Hill Avenue with the window cracked. March air sharp and carrying the last of winter, let it in because it was honest. Past the buildings that had changed their signs and the ones that hadn't. Past the bus stop that was still exactly the same bus stop, the shelter with the scratched plexiglass they posted on the pole beside it. She parked at Forest Hills Cemetery and walked to Section E, Lot 23. She placed the white chrysanthemums against the stone. She sat down on the cold ground. She had been coming here for 12 years. I had sat on this ground in every kind of weather that March in Boston produced. Clear cold, grey cold rain, hated. One year, a late snow that came down while she was sitting there and covered her shoulders, and she'd let it because the weight of it felt appropriate. I had talked about the company, and the contracts and the distribution centers, and the milestones that kept arriving empty. I had talked about all the ways she had tried to fill in the space where he should have been, and all the ways she had failed. This year she didn't talk about any of that. I met someone, Dad. Her voice was quiet, and the voices go quiet when there's no one around to hear them and no need for volume. About a year ago, in the Walmart on Blue Hill Avenue. She paused. Same cart, same coins, same lie about already eating. My cemetery was still around her. A bird somewhere in the trees behind the maintenance shed. The distant sound of traffic on the road beyond the wall. He has 2 kids. A boy who's too serious for 9 years old. A girl who falls asleep anywhere. Plucked a blade of dead grass from the base of the headstone. Turned it between her fingers. The boy holds his father's jacket the way I used to hold yours. Like letting go would mean something permanent. Looked out across the rows of headstones stretching toward the tree line at the edge of the property. Some of them had flowers. Most didn't. I couldn't save you. I was 3 years late, and you were gone before I could put anything in your hands that was worth handing over. And I've been living inside that fact for 11 years. Her voice didn't break. It just went thinner. A material goes thin under sustained pressure without yielding to it. But I think maybe that's why I stopped in that parking lot. Not because I planned it. Not because I'm good or generous, or any of the things that get written about me in articles about the company. I stopped because the universe put your face on a stranger and dared me to walk past it. And I couldn't. I could not walk past your face a second time. She pressed her palm flat against the granite above his name, cold, always cold. Even in summer the stone held a chill that had nothing to do with the air temperature. I've been running for 11 years, she said, building things and buying things, and furnishing the empty rooms and telling myself that the furnishing was the same as the filling. You always knew the difference. Oh, what full looked like and what occupied looked like, and you never confused the two. She exhaled. I think I'm finally starting to learn it. She sat there until the cold worked through her jeans and her knees started to ache. Then she stood, pressed both hands against the stone for a moment. The way you brace against something solid before you turn and walk back into whatever the day requires. She drove to the Walmart on Blue Hill Avenue, not because it was part of the ritual, because she wanted to. Went in through the automatic doors and walked the aisles the way she had walked them for 12 years. Past the cereal where the yellow Cheerios box still sat at the same position on the shelf, past the produce section, past the school supplies. She didn't take a cart. She just walked. At the end of the school supplies aisle she stopped. She thought about a boy holding a box of colored pencils like it was being given and might be taken back. A box from the shelf. 12 count, 247. Then she put it back. He was 9 now. He was in 3rd grade at Kenny Elementary on Glenway Street. A boys and girls club, and a study group, and a father who was going to finish his nursing license, and a neighbor upstairs who watched his sister on Tuesday evenings. That particular moment that had required this specific box of colored pencils had already passed into the permanent record of things that had happened and been resolved. She didn't need to buy it now. Just needed to remember that it had been worth buying then. She walked out of the Walmart empty-handed for the first time in 2 years. It felt right. The graduation ceremony was on a Thursday in May. The notification had come through Lorraine. Not from James directly, which was correct, which was how it should have been. He had sent a text a week before the ceremony. Graduation is the 14th. Like you to be there if you want to. No further information about time or location because he knew she had access to Lorraine, who had access to everything. She had read that text 3 times, 14 months. A Walmart checkout line to this. She found the details through the Bunker Hill website. The LPN cohort graduation ceremony, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the campus auditorium on Rutherford Avenue. She drove herself Honda Accord, same hoodie, jeans, the Cartier under her sleeve because the ceremony was not about her, and the watch was not something she wanted in anyone's field of vision today. Parked in the campus lot and walked in through the front entrance like any other guest, and nobody looked at her twice, and that was exactly what she needed it to be. Auditorium was the kind of room that told you everything about what it was for, without trying to be anything else. Fluorescent fixtures in the ceiling, plastic folding chairs in rows on a poured concrete floor, raised platform at the front, with a wooden podium and a microphone that squeaked when you adjusted it. Water stains in the upper corners of the ceiling tiles from a roof that had been repaired twice and would need repairing again. Air conditioning ran loud enough to compete with conversation, which gave the room a particular buzzing energy that wasn't formal and wasn't casual but was something in between. Not Harvard, not a ballroom with chandeliers and keynote speakers. Hosting better, actually. Something that was exactly what it was. Sandra found a seat in the 3rd row from the back on the aisle side. She sat down and looked at the room filling around her. Families with children on laps, grandparents in church clothes, partners holding flowers, small kids who had been told to sit still and were managing it with variable success. The ordinary beautiful chaos of people watching their people arrive somewhere. Ely was in the front row. see the back of his head from where she sat. The precise, serious posture, the white button-down shirt. He was sitting the way he sat everywhere, as if sitting were a task that required his full attention. Hands were folded in his lap. He was looking at the stage. Teresa Coleman was 2 seats to Eli's right. She had brought Naomi, who was on Teresa's lap with a stuffed cat, gray and white. One ear permanently bent from being held at that angle, name tag around its neck too small to read from this distance. Naomi was not paying attention to the stage. She was engaged in a conversation with the cat that appeared to require her full attention. The ceremony started. Names were called in alphabetical order, which meant Carter came early. Lane read it in the clear voice of someone who had read hundreds of names over the years and still understood that each one was the only name that mattered to at least 6 people in this room. James Carter. Ellie stood up, not halfway, completely. All the way up, both hands coming together above his head, clapping hard, his chin lifted and his mouth open in an expression too large and too specific to be contained by the word smile. 9 years old in a white button-down shirt with the collar slightly crooked because he'd buttoned it himself and refused help, and he was giving his father everything he had. Naomi looked up from the cat at the noise and then, because everyone else seemed to be doing it, she clapped too, both hands, enthusiastic, if imprecise. Teresa Coleman clapped with the measured approval of a woman who had watched a lot of people accomplish a lot of things over 71 years and knew the difference between an achievement and a statement. This was both. Clapped like she meant it. Sandra, in the 3rd row from the back, put her hands together. James walked across the stage in the blue graduation gown he'd been ironing since 5 in the morning. She knew this because Eli had texted her earlier that week. Dad ironed his gown for like an hour. She had sent back a thumbs up, which felt inadequate, but was the right size. He took the certificate from the dean with both hands, not the casual grip of someone collecting a document, the grip of someone receiving something they had been reaching toward for years, and were holding finally at the full extension of their arm. He looked out at the room. He found Eli first. Fate found him the way a person finds the specific thing they have been navigating toward even in a room full of things. Something on his face changed. The composed, careful expression he maintained as a general condition loosening slightly at the jaw, at the corners of his eyes. Then he found Teresa and Naomi. Naomi waved the cat at him. Then he looked back, further back, 3rd row from the end. His eyes found Sandra. She nodded, small. A kind of nod that didn't need anything attached to it, because it was already carrying enough. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he walked off the stage. The ceremony ended, and the room emptied outward into the hallway in the particular effusion of a crowd that has been sitting for an hour and is now released. People spreading out and finding each other, phones going up for photographs, passion running in the sudden space, flowers being pressed into hands. Sandra stayed near the water fountain at the far end of the hallway. She was not navigating toward anything. She was letting the room come to her. Ellie found her first, came through the crowd with the same purposeful directness he brought to everything. Not running, just moving at the speed of someone who had identified a destination and was proceeding to it. He stopped in front of her, looked up with the serious brown eyes that had not changed since the first time she'd seen them in a Walmart checkout line. Dad says you're coming to dinner. Sandra looked at him. He made mac and cheese. A pause. The special kind. From scratch, another pause, delivered with the timing of someone who had considered the order of information carefully. He said he knows you skip meals. He said I should tell you that. Something shifted in her chest, not the folding sensation from a year and a half ago. Something else. Something that moved upward instead of inward, did he? Ellie nodded. He said if you don't come, he'll send Naomi to call you. And she'll talk for a long time. Sandra almost laughed. Almost. It caught in her throat and turned into something closer to the real thing, the kind of laughter that breaks loose from a place inside you that hasn't been open in a long time, the kind you couldn't have faked if you'd tried. That sounds like a credible threat, she said. Eli's expression suggested he agreed completely. And then James was there, looking through the thinning crowd with Naomi on his hip, the cat clutched in Naomi's hand, its bent ear pointing at the ceiling, and Teresa Coleman 2 steps behind him, and the graduation gown over his arm, and the certificate rolled in his hand. He stopped in front of Sandra and held out an envelope, white, small. Her name written on the front in his handwriting, small and even, the handwriting of someone who had learned to write in the margins of things. She opened it. Inside, nails and coins. She counted without thinking, the way you count when your hands already know what they're measuring. $47.65, exact, and a folded piece of paper torn from a composition notebook. She unfolded it. 5 words in the same small, even hand. Nothing else on the page for the next one. Still hungry, Sandra looked at the money, the note, the money again. Her throat closed, just closed, like the way a valve closes when pressure exceeds what it was built for. She stood in a community college hallway in Boston with $47.65 in her hands and a torn piece of notebook paper, and could not produce a single word. A CEO of Warren Logistics Group, the woman who had moved freight through 37 states and negotiated 9-figure contracts and had not lost her composure in a business meeting in 11 years, standing completely still in a hallway, like holding $47.65, unable to speak. She was aware that James was watching her, that Eli was watching her with the same focused attention he brought to everything, that Naomi had abandoned interest in the proceedings and was conducting a separate conversation with the cat. That Teresa Coleman, 2 steps back, looking at the ceiling in the specific way of people who have recognized a private moment and are granting it room. James let the silence run. He understood, she thought, exactly what was happening. As a man who had learned to read the pressure in a room, he knew what the silence meant, and he was not going to fill it with something smaller. She found her voice. Not easily, not cleanly. Back the way feeling comes back into a limb that's been held at an angle too long, in stages, with some initial unsteadiness. You didn't have to do this, I know. His voice was level. Not warm in the demonstrative way. That level was its own kind of warmth, its own kind of steadiness. I wanted to, which was the right answer. The only answer that didn't alter what the gesture meant. She looked at him, the graduation gown folded over his arm, a certificate in his hand. 14 months from a Walmart checkout line to a hallway in this building. 14 months of 2 jobs and early mornings and late nights, and a kitchen table and bones memorized in the dark while his children slept. Whoever comes next, she said. Not a question. What he meant, somebody's going to be short $3 a checkout line somewhere, he said. Somebody's going to have the cart with nothing in it for themselves. They do. That's what it's for. She thought about her father at the kitchen table. She thought about the word he had used once, speaking to an empty room. Pretending. The hardest part about being poor isn't the hungry. Pretending you're not hungry so your child doesn't worry. She thought about what it would have meant, in that kitchen at that hour, for someone to have knocked on the door and said, I see what you're doing. It matters. You don't have to pretend. About how much it would have cost. Not in money, in the willingness to see someone clearly and then say so. I hear you skipped meals too, James said. She blinked, looked up at him. Eli told me, a pause. He's observant, Ellie. Aside, his father did not confirm or deny this. He simply stood the way he always stood, alert and present, measuring the situation. Sandra looked at the boy, at the crooked collar of the white button-down shirt he'd buttoned himself and refused help with, at the same serious brown eyes that had been watching the world carefully since before she'd known they existed. He is, she said. From somewhere behind James, Naomi had decided she had been patient long enough and tugged his sleeve. Are we going home? I want to show Mac and Cheese the kitchen. James looked at his daughter. Mac and Cheese is the cat, he said to Sandra. She named him. Of course she did. He shifted Naomi to his other hip, looked at Sandra. Come to dinner, not a question, not a request. The same register he used when he stated facts about logistics. It's the register he trusted most. She looked at the money in her hand, the note. She folded the note carefully and put it in the pocket of her hoodie, next to her phone. I'd find it later tonight when she went to set the phone on the counter, and the paper crinkled against her fingers. What time? She said. James's expression shifted. Just slightly. A string shifts when it's been tuned correctly and finally produces the note it was always meant to make. 6:30, he said. Eli sets the table at 6. She looked at Eli. He nodded once, confirming the operational detail. And from down the hall, Teresa Coleman called out, not loudly, but with the carrying quality of a woman who had spent 3 decades projecting her voice across classrooms. Are we standing here all afternoon? Or are we going somewhere? That was the thing that finally did it. Not the money, not the note, not the ceremony or the B+ or the 14 months of bi-weekly phone calls or the cemetery or the parking lot. The completely ordinary impatience of a 71-year-old woman who had watched a baby on Tuesday evenings for a year and was now done standing in a hallway. Sandra laughed. Real, actual, the kind that came from the same place as the tears in the parking lot, the same reservoir, different direction. The kind that broke the surface because the pressure finally exceeded the membrane, and it had to go somewhere. But this time the direction was up. James looked at her with something in his expression she had not seen there before. Not quite a smile, the pre-smile. The thing a face does when it is deciding whether the moment is one that gets a smile or something larger. He let it be something larger. Naomi, deciding this was a good development, laughed too for reasons entirely her own. Ellie did not laugh. The corners of his mouth moved. In Eli terms, this was approximately equivalent. They walked out of the building together. Teresa first, because she was already moving, her pace unhurried but definite, pace of a woman who had made a decision and was implementing it. Then James with Naomi on his hip and the graduation gown under his arm and the certificate in his hand. Then Eli, walking with the careful propriety that was simply his way of being in the world. Sandra walked at the back. They crossed the parking lot in the late afternoon light, the May sun low and warm, throwing long shadows from the campus buildings. His building was 12 minutes from the campus by surface roads. Sandra followed James's car in hers, the Honda Accord trailing the faded silver Civic through the Dorchester streets. And she thought about the last time she had driven these streets on a March morning with the windows cracked and the air cold and coming in, saying that her father was in the passenger seat. Even though the passenger seat was empty, the feeling had not been wrong. He had not been in the car in the literal sense, but the question he had spent his whole life inside, the question of what you do with love when you can't spend it on the person it was meant for. That question had been in the car with her, and it had been pointing her somewhere, here, 12 minutes from his cemetery, 3 blocks from the school he'd sent her past, 2 miles from the Walmart, where he'd bought the same Yepler box of cereal from the same shelf every Thursday evening and called it fine. Here, baked behind the Civic, and followed them into the building and up the stairs, and into an apartment that was 380 square feet of exactly what it was. A studio on Geneva Avenue with a kitchenette and a radiator, and 2 children's drawings taped to the refrigerator, and a kitchen table with 4 chairs that was 2 chairs more than the space technically allowed. Mac and Cheese the cat was placed ceremonially on the floor, where he immediately went under the table. Ellie disappeared into what served as the sleeping area, and came back without the white button-down shirt, wearing a plain grey t-shirt, which Sandra understood was the post-ceremony transition back to operational clothing. James handed her a glass of water and told her to sit down. She did, at the kitchen table that was too large for the room and absolutely necessary. And then, there was the smell of mac and cheese from scratch, which was not the version from a box, but the actual made thing, and the particular sound of a kitchen being operated with purpose, and Naomi explaining something at length to the cat under the table, and Eli getting plates down from the cabinet with the systematic efficiency of someone who set tables the way other people filed reports. Sandra sat at the kitchen table with her glass of water and the folded paper in her pocket and the Cartier under her sleeve. She sat at the table and watched a man who had learned to be unhurried with patience because he had learned it first at kitchen tables, very much like this one, who had built, out of the specific materials of a hard life, a capacity for a kind of patience that was not resignation but attention, the full present. This person matters attention that no program could teach and no scholarship could quantify. She sat at the table and thought, my father would have understood this man completely. And then, Eli set a plate in front of her, with the precise placement of someone who understood that every detail executed correctly was a form of respect. and James put a serving spoon in the dish in the center of the table. And Naomi climbed into her chair and looked at Sandra with the direct, clear gaze of a 4-year-old who had not yet learned to be indirect about anything. "You eat first," Aoife said, pointing at Sandra with the absolute authority of someone issuing an instruction that was not open for discussion. Papa already ate. The kitchen went very still. James stood at the counter with the serving dish in his hands, looked at his daughter, at Sandra. The expression on his face was something she had not seen there before. Not quite a smile, not quite tears, somewhere in the exact middle of those two things, a place where things land when they are too large for any single emotion, and require all of them simultaneously. Sandra looked at the 4-year-old with the serious eyes and the plate of mac and cheese in front of her. Thought about a kitchen on Humboldt Avenue. She thought about a man at a table late at night speaking to an empty room. She thought about the word pretending, and she thought, "Not this time, not this time." "He didn't," Sandra said. Her voice was steady. "And neither did you." She reached for the serving spoon. She put food on her plate, and for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, Sandra Warren sat down at a table that was not her own, apartment that was not her own, with people who had no obligation to her and no expectation of her, and she ate first, not because anyone had asked her to, not because it was a gesture or a symbol or a lesson she was trying to enact, but because she was hungry, because being hungry was allowed, because the man across the table had reminded her, through the very specific math of $47.65 and a torn piece of notebook paper, that the people who gave everything deserved to receive something back. Not as payment, not as charity, as recognition, as the simple human acknowledgement that you were a person who mattered. That was where everything started. She stayed for 2 hours, not because she planned to. She had planned to eat and make a reasonable exit and drive back to the penthouse before the evening got too late. They had a board call at 8 in the morning and a distribution contract that needed final review and the particular discipline of her own life that had kept everything moving for 11 years by not allowing the edges to blur. Edges blurred anyway. It started because Naomi, partway through the meal, decided that Sandra needed to know about the cat. Not just the name and the provenance. She'd been rescued from the Boys and Girls Club lost and found bin, left behind by someone who'd never come back for her, which Naomi had explained to the cat as a feature rather than a tragedy. But the cat's full biographical inventory, her food preferences, her sleeping habits, a specific way she meowed at the window in the mornings that meant birds and not other things. This briefing took 11 minutes and required the cat to be present as a visual aid. Sandra received it with complete attention, because the briefing was being given by a 4-year-old who had decided that Sandra was a person worth briefing, which was a form of trust that did not arrive with explanations and had to be received the way it was given. Ely, across the table, watched this interaction with the evaluative focus he brought to everything. He was assessing something. She could see the assessment running. She'd been able to see it running since the first time she'd looked at him in a Walmart checkout line. Those steady, measuring eyes taking everything in and filing it somewhere for later. James ate and let the room be what it was. He was good at that. His ability to hold space without filling it, to be present without requiring the room to organize itself around his presence. The nursing supervisor's word came back to her, unhurried. It is not a professional skill he had learned. It was the fundamental orientation of a man who had been paying very close attention for a very long time, because the cost of inattention in his life had always been real. After dinner, Eli cleared the plates with the systematic efficiency he'd shown with the table setting, and Naomi fell asleep against Sandra's arm on the couch with the suddenness that 4-year-olds fall asleep, present and then entirely absent. Fatal stage. Sandra sat very still. She had not held a sleeping child against her arm in a long time, possibly ever, and she was unprepared for the specific quality of the weight of it. Not heavy, but real in a way that was different from the weight of objects. James came out of the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee, black for both of them. He handed her one and sat in the chair across from the couch. Ely had disappeared somewhere with a book. Sandra understood was his version of giving the adults the room. She does that. James said, nodding toward Naomi. Wherever she lands, I believe it, Sandra said. James was quiet for a moment. What else did the file say? They thought about it. The 22 years of his mother's employment, the insulin copay, the supervisor's notation, the address on Humboldt Avenue where Harold Reed had ironed his uniform and she had grown up 3 miles from this apartment. We're good at this, she said. The nursing. Before you left, the rotation supervisor put it in writing. He looked at the coffee cup. That was a long time ago. Same hands, same instincts. A pause. Answered a question in week 4 of the program that the rest of the class couldn't. Dr. Young stopped the lecture. He looked up. How did you know that, Lorraine? A long moment. Assessed the scope of what that represented. Not with alarm, but with the particular sensation of someone realizing they had been watched over from a greater distance and with more attention than they'd known. Is there anything you don't know? Like your mother's favorite food, Sandra said. I don't know that. The question landed exactly where she'd intended it, not in the register of intrusion, but in the register of genuinely wanting to know. Not information, something else. Held the coffee cup. Looked at the window where the city was doing what it did at 9 in the evening in Dorchester, all that ordinary light. Sweet potato pie, he said. She made it every Thanksgiving. She'd start 2 days early, a pause. She said the filling had to sit before it was right. She said everything good needed time to be ready. Sandra thought about that. She would have liked being a grandmother, she said. He didn't respond immediately. Looked at Naomi asleep on the couch. At the doorway where Eli had disappeared. Yeah, he said, not with grief. With the kind of certainty that is its own form of love. She really would have. They sat with that. 2 cups of coffee going warm between them, a sleeping child on the couch, the radiator doing its periodic thing in the corner, the city outside going about its evening. Sandra thought about what she had said at the cemetery that morning, wasting. About the difference between furnishing empty rooms and filling them. They thought about what it felt like to sit in a too small kitchen at a too large table and eat food that someone had made from scratch and eat it because she was hungry and say so. I'd spent 11 years building things that were supposed to make her feel arrived. None of it had made her feel arrived. It had made her feel located. There was a difference. Arriving implied completing something, like reaching the thing the whole previous motion had been pointing toward. She thought about what the whole previous motion had actually been pointing toward. Like thought about a girl carrying all the grocery bags to the car so her father wouldn't have to, and her father watching her do it with an expression she hadn't understood then. Not pride, not relief, but a kind of witnessed helplessness, a face of a man who wanted to carry his own things and was watching his daughter carry them and loving her for it and breaking a little for it at the same time. She thought about what he had needed most that she had never learned how to give him. Not the bags, not the $1 million, not the distribution center in Nashville or the penthouse or the Cartier on her wrist. Just someone to look him in the eye and say, I see you, the full version of you. Not the uniform and the pressed shoes and the performance of having it handled. Version that was tired and had a back that didn't straighten right and went to bed hungry sometimes and talked to empty rooms at midnight because the things he needed to say had nowhere else to go. I see you. That was the whole thing. That was what $47.65 was trying to say. That was what the torn piece of notebook paper was trying to say. That was what a man who had learned to be unhurried with patience because he had learned it first at a kitchen table was every day trying to do for people who were only briefly in his care. The paper in her hoodie pocket said, for the next one, I'm hungry. She understood that now in a way she hadn't entirely understood when she'd read it in the hallway. The money was not the point. The money was proof of concept. Evidence that the thing could move, that it had moved, wishing that a woman in a parking lot had stopped. And a man in a checkout line had opened a door, and somewhere in the chain between those two events, a nurse had been added to the world who understood that the most important thing he could give his patients was exactly what Beverly Carter had never had enough of. Like someone who was not in a hurry, someone who would stay until the person in front of them felt seen. They transferred Naomi carefully from her arm to the couch cushions, the child's head settling without waking. James watched from his chair with the readiness of a father who had done this 10,000 times and was letting someone else do it once. Like Naomi slept on, Sandra stood up, picked up the coffee cup and took it to the kitchen counter because Harold Reed had raised her to be the kind of person who took the cup to the counter. James came to the kitchen doorway. "Thank you for coming," they said. "Thank you for inviting me." They stood there for a moment in the small kitchen with the city outside the window, doing its ordinary indifferent thing. She could hear Eli turning a page in the other room, hear Naomi's breathing from the couch, deep and even. She thought about what her father used to say after the Thursday evenings at the Gigi's diner. A kiss. Standing in the parking lot with the bags from the Walmart and the cold air coming in off the street, while she talked about whatever had happened at school that week, listened with the full unhurried attention of a man who had exactly one agenda, and the agenda was her. He used to say, "That's what I'm here for, baby, just that. Simple, no ceremony." I'd spent 11 years trying to understand what for meant. What the purpose was behind the sacrifice. What the whole motion of Harold Reed's life had been pointing toward. She thought she understood it now. Not an answer. Not a destination. Just the willingness to show up in the places where you were needed and stay until the thing that needed doing was done. She picked up her jacket from the chair by the door. "I'll be in touch," she said. James nodded. The same nod she had given him at the graduation ceremony. Small, carrying more than words, she went to the door, and then Eli appeared from the sleeping area doorway, materialized the way he materialized. With no wasted motion, he looked at her. "Look, the drawing on the refrigerator," he said. "The blue one." She turned. "I made it when Dad started school." He looked at the drawing from across the apartment, considering it the way people consider things they have made and are not entirely sure have translated from what they intended. "It's the Charles River." From the bridge on the way to Bunker Hill, Sandra looked at the drawing, the blue, ocean lines. The person on the bridge, which she could see now, the figure she had thought might be a person, and was, why the river, she said, because Dad used to look at it when he crossed the bridge. Every time, a pause, like it reminded him that things keep moving. Like Sandra stood in the doorway of a 380-square-foot apartment on Geneva Avenue and looked at a 9-year-old's drawing of the Charles River and thought about every morning she had stood at her floor-to-ceiling window in the penthouse and looked at the same river from 34 floors above it. A river, moving the same direction, carrying different things. "Tell your dad I'll see him in 2 weeks, she said. Ely nodded. Official, mission received. She walked out down the stairs and through the lobby and out onto Geneva Avenue. The night was cool, and the streetlights were on, and the ordinary sounds of a Dorchester evening surrounded her. The traffic, the voices from an upstairs window, a particular acoustic signature of a neighborhood that had been living its life for a long time and would keep living it long after she was gone. She walked to the Honda, got in, sat for a moment without starting the engine. In her pocket, white paper, in her memory, the 5 words Naomi had said at the dinner table, with the absolute authority of a 4-year-old, issuing an instruction that was not open for discussion. "You eat first." Papa already ate. Except this time, and this was the thing, this was the whole thing. The thing that $47.65 and a torn piece of composition paper had been trying to say from the beginning. This time it wasn't a lie. This time, a man who had spent 3 years building a life stable enough that the people around him were eating well and sleeping enough and going to school and growing up in an apartment where someone came home at a reasonable hour, had sat down at a table and been genuinely, actually full, not pretending, not performing hunger management, not making his portion smaller so someone else's could be larger, actually full. Sandra started the engine, drove home through Dorchester and into South Boston and over the bridge and up through the financial district and through Back Bay to the parking garage 2 blocks from the penthouse. She rode the elevator to the 34th floor. She walked through the apartment without turning on the lights because the city coming through the windows was sufficient. She stood at the glass. The Charles River was down there, black and moving, carrying whatever it carried. Out about Eli's drawing, blue, motion lines. The figure on the bridge looking down at the water. Things keep moving. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the folded paper and did not take it out. She already knew what it said. Oh, what it said for the rest of her life. The same way she knew the words Harold Reed had spoken to an empty room at midnight, more than 30 years ago. The same way you know things that were said in the dark by people who were being honest when no one was supposed to be listening. She stood at the window. Dark Syssids. The city was enormous and bright, and full of people getting through their evenings in the particular ways available to them. Somewhere in all of that, in a structure that ran from checkout lines to kitchen tables, to cemetery headstones, to buildings full of people who were starting to notice each other, the links were holding. She had not saved anyone, fixed anything. She had stopped walking past. And that, as it turned out, was the beginning of everything. Not a grand gesture, not a billionaire's intervention, not a program with a name and a budget and a press release. Faced a woman standing in a parking lot who recognized something and decided that this time, unlike the last time, she was not going to keep walking. That was the whole of it. That was what the 4765 was for. Not to pay her back. Not pay back the thing it was trying to pay back. That math never closed. But you could pass it forward. They could take the thing that had been given to you and find the next person standing in the next checkout line with the next cart. Full of everything for their children and nothing for themselves. They could place your box of cereal on the belt beside theirs and say, "I see what you're doing, it matters. You matter, you don't have to carry this alone." The next one. Still hungry, she pressed her palm flat against the cold glass, the same way she pressed it against the granite, the same way you press your hand against a door. When you know someone is standing on the other side, the river kept moving. She held it there for a long time,